It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the ASUS PA278QV. As usual for a video review, what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software, depends on the processing done by YouTube, and ultimately it depends on the screen that you're actually viewing the video on, so it doesn't accurately represent what the monitor looks like in person. Remember that there's also a full written review, and you can find a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. This model uses a 27-inch IPS type panel with 2560 by 1440 resolution and 75Hz refresh rate. More specifically, it's an Innolux AAS, azimuthal anchoring switch technology, an IPS type technology. The 27-inch screen size and the WQHD resolution, it's a nice comfortable sort of level, I find, in terms of the pixel density, in terms of the desktop real estate. So it gives you a good amount of desktop real estate, good for multitasking, so you get lots of quite crisp looking text on the screen and images and other things. So there's definitely nice multitasking potential there, or if you just want to focus on a single document, you can have a nice spread of pages there as well. And again, the text is nice and crisp. You won't be able to appreciate this on the video, but certainly a decent pixel density. And it also means that when you're playing games and that kind of thing, you have a nice level of detail and clarity there as well. Something I like to talk about early on in my reviews is the screen surface, because it's very important, and it's something which I feel that most reviewers kind of skirt over and don't really look at in enough detail. It's of pivotal importance to the overall experience. On this model, it is a light matte anti-glare screen surface. I've got no idea why it keeps cycling my wallpapers at the speed of light here, sorry about that. But anyway, the screen surface, light matte anti-glare, and it has a good smooth finish to it, a relatively smooth finish I should say, so it isn't like a glossy screen surface, but as far as matte surfaces go, it's a good one. It offers decent glare handling, but it doesn't impede the image as much as stronger matte screen surfaces, so it doesn't have a layered appearance in front of the image, so that's nice. Whilst a relatively smooth finish to the surface, it keeps the image free from obvious graininess. Really, there's nothing to complain about. I'm very sensitive to graininess, and this model does have a relatively smooth appearance. As far as matte surfaces go, it's about as smooth as I've seen actually, so really good in that respect. I'm now going to talk about the external features of the monitor. So as you can see, it has a smart home office design, sensible material choices, so no glossy plastic here, nice matte plastic. There's a silver painted ASUS logo in the middle there, so nothing shiny there either. And you can see the OSD controls there with some fairly visible dots in the middle, and the power button also labelled. It has a little silver coloured stripe at the bottom so you don't accidentally press that. Even in a fairly dim room you can see those buttons, so that's quite nice. And when you press them, the labels appear on screen. There's also a cable tidy loop at the bottom of the stand base there. And although it's very subtle, difficult to see, there's actually a ruler built into the bottom bezel at the top lip there. And that has numbered centimetre markings on. So it goes all the way up to 60 centimetres. So that can be useful to use in a pinch if you just need a little ruler there. At your desk, you've got one with the bottom bezel. The top and side bezels, they use the popular dual stage design, and that means that you've got a slender panel border that's flush with the rest of the screen, and you've also got a thin hard plastic outer component. And although it's difficult to see, it's something I like to point out. There's a tiny little mark, the top left and top right, or top right and top left I should say. When I say mark, it looks like a little section of the panel border is missing. There's just a tiny little dot that isn't quite as dark as the rest of it. That's completely normal. It's a calibration mark used by the machine that puts the panel together. The screen surface used on this one is light matte anti-glare, so it offers decent glare handling whilst keeping the image relatively vibrant, relatively clean. From the side you can see that the screen is relatively slender at its thinnest point, but it bulks out centrally where the stand attaches. At the left side here there are also two USB 3 ports. The included stand offers good ergonomic flexibility, so you can tilt it backwards and forwards a little bit. You can adjust the height. You can swivel it right and left. You can see that the swivel actually goes rather far. The exact measurements are given in the written review. And you can also rotate it clockwise or anti-clockwise into portrait. Be careful to tilt it at the end there, otherwise you can scrape the stand base. At the rear you can see it's mainly matte black plastic. It has a few different textures. So it's got this kind of brush texture centrally, plain matte black at the bottom and top, and this sort of corrugated texture at the sides. There's a cable tidy loop, or kind of rectangle if you prefer. Towards the bottom right there's a K-slot, and the included stand attaches centrally and attaches using a quick release mechanism. So if you push that up there, that button, you'll be able to quickly detach the included stand, and that will reveal 100 by 100mm VESA holes for alternative mounting. The ports face downwards, so at the left side here you can see the AC power input, which means the monitor has an internal power converter. There's also a 0-watt power switch to allow you to completely shut off power to the monitor if you like. At the right side you can see the remaining ports of the monitor, or the main ports of the monitor. So there's a dual-link DVI, there's HDMI 1.4, DisplayPort 1.2A and Mini DisplayPort 1.2A. So HDMI and DisplayPort, and indeed the Mini DisplayPort, they all allow you to use the monitor at 2560 by 1440 at up to 75 Hz, as long as your system supports that. So that's HDMI 1.4 and above, and DisplayPort 1.2 would allow that. If you're using HDMI, you can also use FreeSync on compatible AMD GPUs and systems, and with DisplayPort 1.2A, and that includes the Mini DisplayPort because they have the same capabilities, you get adaptive sync support including AMD FreeSync and NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode. There's a 3.5mm audio input and a 3.5mm headphone jack. There's a USB upstream port and two USB 3 downstream ports. So that's two further USB 3 downstream ports, with also those ones on the left side of the monitor, if you're viewing it from the front that is. So there's 4 in total. There are two 2-watt speakers integrated into the monitor. They're up-firing. They offer basic sound output. It really isn't particularly high quality, so they're really just there to facilitate really very basic sound output. You can use them in a pinch, but they're not going to give you the kind of quality of a decent set of headphones or standalone speakers. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about the contrast performance of the monitor. So this model has an IPS type panel. Contrast certainly isn't its main strength, but it offers a contrast ratio of around 1000 to 1, and that's what I measured as well as what's specified. And the two don't always coincide, so sometimes you have models which are a bit higher than this and sometimes a bit lower, so this one is pretty average really, quite in the middle in terms of its static contrast performance. So you don't get incredible depth and inkiness to these dark shades and dark areas. That's really not what panels like this are all about, or models like this are all about. But as I said, some models are weaker in static contrast, some IPS type models. LG's nano IPS models, they're high refresh rate ones, 27-inch models, they tend to be somewhat weaker than this. So there are certainly some weaker IPS models out there, some a little bit stronger, but as I said, this one's quite middling in terms of its static contrast performance. Of course, a key feature with IPS models like this, or IPS type panels, is IPS glow. So you can see this kind of hazy appearance towards the top and bottom left corners of the screen. It tends to be a bit stronger from a normal viewing position towards the bottom of the screen, and that's because the ergonomically correct viewing position would have you sitting a little bit above centre. But I know depending on your posture and all sorts of things, and monitors are quite big these days, monitors like this, you might be sitting more centrally. So in general it does tend to be more noticeable towards the bottom, but you may well notice it a bit towards the top as well. And it can be brought out more strongly by backlight bleed or clouding, so dark uniformity issues like that. On my unit I do have a bit of clouding and backlight bleed. It's not too bad, you can expect some though. It's not specific to this model, it's just that it's very common to have some degree of this on models more broadly, and certainly IPS type panels are not immune to this at all. So I do actually have a bit of clouding towards the top left, which tends to bring out this glow a little bit more in that region. But either way, it's definitely a feature, and you also see it towards the right side. It's just that this particular scene, it's kind of difficult to show you that. And you'll see that the camera adjusts, unfortunately, when it shows the brighter content. But to my eye, I can see that towards the right side of the screen as well. And it is a bit stronger towards the bottom of the screen. But anyway, this IPS glow, it does get rid of atmosphere. But on this model, it's a moderate amount of IPS glow, really very typical for a 27-inch IPS type panel. And unlike some models, it doesn't have strong colours to the glow. It's fairly consistent. The shade does change a bit. It tends to be cooler towards the left of the screen and actually more noticeable towards the left of the screen because of that, particularly the bottom left. You can actually see this difference. It kind of looks more golden or slightly greenish gold towards the top and a cooler tint towards the bottom. And this cooler tint, it may not appear like this in the video, but to the eye, the cooler tint tends to be more noticeable. Towards the right side of the screen, it's actually warm in both regions, and actually towards the bottom right, it's not really a big feature. But as I mentioned, I do have a bit of clouding towards the top right, and that can bring it out more noticeably. Another thing which would bring it out more noticeably is if you're sitting close to the screen, and also if you're using a relatively high brightness. But a very nice thing about IPS type models like this is the gamma consistency. So the detail levels are well maintained throughout the screen. Yes, of course, you do have this IPS glow which does bloom out quite a lot, and the center of the screen isn't affected by that, so the detail levels are technically a bit better in the center of the screen, but it doesn't have the those clear differences you get on TN models, where towards the top of the screen things look far too masked, and that's because the perceived gamma is too high. Whereas lower down the screen there'd be far too much detail on these TN models. This can give you a banded or blocky appearance as unintended details are revealed, so you don't get any of that. Even on VA models you have these differences where perceived gamma is much higher in the center versus towards the edges of the screen, and particularly lower down on the screen, where the perceived gamma there is somewhat lower than it should be. So this is often overlooked or poorly understood, but it is certainly a key aspect of the IPS viewing experience, and it's something which some people quite like. So as I was mentioning before, this IPS glow, it is a feature, but if you're sitting in a very dark room now, you know, the dark shades really don't look very deep at all, and the glow is very noticeable. But if you've got a bit of brightness in the room, this isn't a bright room by any means, but it's just not pitch black anymore. The IPS glow does have a bit of an edge taken off it. You can certainly still notice it unless the room is particularly bright, and then you'll actually get some glare on the screen depending on your lighting situation, which isn't ideal either. But it's just to mention that when I show you these videos, I tend to sit in a dark room for the contrast section because it helps highlight these weaknesses more clearly. And that is something which you'd observe by eye as well. But in slightly brighter environments, the IPS glow has a bit of an edge taken off it. For the brighter content, the screen surface, as I mentioned before, light matte anti-glare with a relatively smooth finish, so it doesn't have an obvious grainy look to it or a layered appearance or anything like that. And the brighter shades do stand out quite nicely against the darker surroundings, although of course it doesn't have the kind of pop you'd get from a model with much stronger static contrast. I'm now on Lagom, that's lagom.nl, the website, and their tests for viewing angles. The Lagom text looks a nice blended grey throughout the screen. There is a little bit of green to the striping in some regions, more towards the top of the screen, and it goes a little bit red towards the bottom of the screen, but this is subtle. It doesn't have any clear flashes of orange, red or green or any saturated shades there. The purple block appears a pinkish purple hue throughout, and this can appear quite weird on the camera. This often happens, but in reality it's nice and consistent. It does appear a pinkish purple, so it doesn't have the kind of shifts you'd see on VA or TN models, where some regions would appear more lilac, so more of a blue shade, and others have a stronger pink hue, and the pink hue would shift very readily with head movement. There is a bit of a shift in pink hue with enough head movement on this model. And that's quite typical on IPS type models, so for this particular shade there are some shifts, but from a normal viewing position, good consistency. The red block appears a good solid rich red throughout the screen, no complaints there. On some models it tends to have a burnt or pinkish hue in some regions of the screen, and it looks richer in others, but with this one, with a strong colour consistency, it looks very good. The green block appears a slightly yellowish green chartreuse throughout, and again it's nice and consistent. It doesn't have any regions that are clearly more yellow than others, as you get with models that have weaker colour consistency, and the blue block there, a good solid royal blue. I'm now on Battlefield 5, and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. So as I showed you with Lagom, colours are very consistent, and that means that a shade displayed centrally appears very much the same as that same shade displayed towards the edges of the screen. So you don't get the kind of shifts you get on VA or moreover TN panels, and things appear appropriately rich throughout the screen. The colour gamut extends a little bit beyond sRGB, but this isn't an extreme extension beyond, so things don't look clearly oversaturated. There's just a little bit of extra saturation and a little bit of extra vibrancy, but really things look very much as the developers intend. Things aren't taken too far off base in that respect. So it does give a rich and natural look to things. Things don't look washed out, but they don't have strong saturation or a very vibrant look. So really it depends what kind of viewer you are. Some people prefer things to look very vibrant and saturated, and a wide colour gamut might suit them. But for other people, they prefer the content to look more as the developers intend, and that's really what this model delivers very nicely. So there are some nice rich browns and reddish browns and orange hues, and a nice palette of greens. And unlike on some models, these greens don't have this obvious yellow tint. So models with a wider colour gamut, they tend to bring out the yellow elements to these yellowish greens too strongly, and they can look a little bit off for that reason. And the same with the reds of the wood there and other kind of reddish brown shades you might observe. They appear nice and neutral on this model. It doesn't have an obvious red hue. The reds are brought out just a little bit too strongly, but only a little bit. It's really very slight, and that is again consistent throughout the screen. But this is so slight that really things look far more neutral than they do on wide gamut models displaying this same sRGB content. The monitor doesn't have an sRGB emulation setting which would restrict the colour gamut strictly to sRGB, but as I said, the extension beyond isn't extreme, and really if you are particularly interested in colour accuracy and that's useful for your work, then I would consider on this model or any model profiling it with a colorimeter or spectrophotometer, and that will really yield the best results in that respect. It's a very good investment if you're interested in that kind of thing. But otherwise, this model has just a bit of extension beyond sRGB, and at least on my unit, the factory calibration was very good indeed. So I really don't have any major complaints at all in terms of its colour reproduction. I'm back on Battlefield 5, and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. This monitor has a 75Hz panel, so that gives you a slight edge over 60Hz. You've got 1.25 times as much visual information every second outputted. So this gives you a slight edge in terms of the connected feel, and by that I mean the precision and fluidity you feel when you interact with the game world. It's something which high refresh rate models really hammer home. On this one, because it's not a huge difference, it doesn't have the same connected feel as a high refresh rate model, but it does give you a bit of an edge over 60Hz. The monitor also has fairly low input lag, which aids the connected feel. So I measured just a little bit over 5 milliseconds, and at this level, at a 75Hz model, that's really very good. If you're really sensitive to input lag, then frankly, you're going to be so sensitive to the lower connected feel of the lower refresh rate anyway, and really you should probably stick to higher refresh rate models. So as far as I'm concerned, good low level of input lag, no real issues there. Connected feel is improved a little bit from the boost to 75Hz, and it is also dependent on your frame rate. So I've got the game running at a good solid 75 frames a second, so I'm taking full advantage of that 75Hz refresh rate. The other advantage this gives is that you have a slight reduction in perceived blur due to eye movement, and this is a concept which is explored in the written review and also the linked article there all about responsiveness, because the concept of perceived blur, it is an important one to understand, but it isn't something which I need to give a technical explanation of in the videos because they're long enough as it is. Another key factor when it comes to perceived blur is the pixel responses or the pixel response times, and on this model they're quite strong actually. They're good, nice convincing 75Hz performance there. So there aren't really any proper standout weaknesses. So there's nothing like you'd get on a VA model or even some slower IPS type models where you can have what I'd call perhaps smeary trailing. So there's a bit of what I'd call powdery trailing. So this means that for some transitions where there's this kind of darker shade there and a medium to bright shade in the background, these are some of the slowest transitions that this model performs, and even they are fairly snappy. So there isn't anything really distinct that'll come across in the video. Most likely this will just appear like everything else, but there's just a little bit of a slight trail behind the object due to some slight weaknesses in pixel responses there. But again, I stress the slight, and This is really isolated to a small number of pixel transitions. Most of them are fast enough for a really good, solid 75Hz performance without additional issues there. I'd definitely recommend checking out the written review and the Pursuit photographs there, because they show the motion performance in a clearer and more accurate way. And it also shows you the effect of the pixel overdrive setting, trace free. I'm not going to go through this in too much detail. There are many settings, 0, 20, 40, 60, 80 and 100, so good flexibility with the pixel overdrive, but I'm using 60, which is the default setting, and as I explain in the written review, I consider this optimal. With this setting, you do get a little bit of overshoot, so you might not even be able to see this on the video because it's not strong or obvious overshoot, but there's a bit of halo trailing behind the block there with the sand in the background that stands out just a little bit because it's actually brighter than even the sand in the background. Or it appears brighter and it's kind of semi-transparent. There is a slightly clearer example of this, actually probably the clearest I could find in this game. Here, at the edge here, this may come across on the video. Again, this is halo trailing and it appears kind of partially transparent, so it's what I like to call snail slime trailing. It's very difficult to say that. But this is not bright or obnoxious overshoot, it's not widespread, it's only for a select few transitions where it even appears at all, so it's not something I'd worry about. But if you are particularly sensitive to overshoot, you can consider setting trace free to 40. So you can see that in the image section of the OSD. If you set that to 40, it does get rid of this overshoot, and actually the reason I don't look at any lower settings than 40 is because there's really no overshoot to speak of using trace-free 40, so there's no good reason to use any lower than a trace-free level of 40. But you do get an increase in this powdery trailing. It's more noticeable. Actually, for this transition, it's quite similar, but there's more powdery trailing around the block. Where I was showing you overshoot before, it's now being replaced with this powdery trailing. And where it says open range there as well, it's a bit of powdery trailing which wasn't there with trace-free 60. So I prefer trace-free 60, but depending on your own preferences, 40 might work well. And really it's still pretty fast with trace-free 40 anyway, so if you really don't like overshoot, then absolutely feel free to use this instead. I've ramped up my graphics settings now. I'm back on my preferred trace-free 60 setting. And I'm going to talk about adaptive sync. This monitor does support adaptive sync, and that means you can use AMD FreeSync as an AMD GPU or system user, and you can use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode if you've got a compatible NVIDIA GPU. So you'll see the frame rate, which is in the top right there. It's now around 60 frames a second. It does vary a little bit either side of that. But what I notice now is there is a bit of a drop off in connected feel. As I was mentioning before, 75Hz gives you a bit of an edge there, but you do get a drop in that because the frame rate is lower. That isn't something which adaptive sync can help with. However, what I don't get is I don't get tearing or stuttering from frame rate and refresh rate mismatches. So if I've got the technology disabled and I'm using VSync, I get obvious stuttering, obvious to me. Sensitivity to this does vary. And if I've got VSync disabled and also adaptive sync disabled, then I get obvious tearing, and again, obvious to me and obvious to users who are sensitive to that. Not necessarily going to notice it so much. But with this reduction in refresh rate, the overshoot I was showing you before is a bit more obvious. And I'll actually show you that more obvious example that I found over here, because I think that's a better example of it. So it is brighter now. This halo trailing does stand out more. But again, it's really just isolated to a relatively slim number of transitions. So this might not necessarily be bothersome to you. You might not necessarily notice it depending on the content you're actually looking at. I've just increased my graphics settings a bit. So I'm now at 52 or 53 frames a second, 52, 53 Hertz. And I should mention as well, if you go into the menu, it'll show you the refresh rate that the monitor's running at whilst you actually enter the menu. So it doesn't update in real time, but it just updates once when you actually enter the menu system. So you can see that says 54 Hertz there. Now with my AMD GPU, I was able to get down to 48 Hertz, which is what is advertised for the monitor, or what you'd expect from FreeSync, I should say. Whereas with my NVIDIA GPU, it went down to 52 Hertz before the technology deactivates. So this is as low as I can get on my NVIDIA GPU. I'm using an NVIDIA GTX 1080 Ti at the moment. So this is the strongest overshoot you'll see. or the strongest really I've observed. And you can see some of this bright halo trailing, but even then it's not extreme. So, it's not extreme, it's not widespread, and actually the technology is now deactivated completely, because when it goes below the floor of operation, then it just deactivates. It doesn't have LFC or anything like that, because the variable refresh rate range isn't high enough for that. The ceiling isn't double the floor, in other words. But again, if you want to get rid of the overshoot, switch over to Trace-Free 40. Now it's gone. It is replaced with some slight powdery trailing, but actually at these lower refresh rates, the pixel response requirements are lower as well. So 40 works quite nicely here. So it's a decent fallback if you just don't like overshoot, but I still prefer 60. It does give a slight edge even here, and I'm not too bothered about the overshoot. I'm fairly sensitive to overshoot, to be honest, but my main gaming monitor is still the good old Dell S2716DG, and that model has quite a bit of overshoot, so I've become quite conditioned to it, quite used to it. And on this model, I really don't find it obnoxious, even with adaptive sync and even where it's at the bottom of its VRR range. To wrap up then, I liked the ergonomic flexibility of the monitor. It has full ergonomic flexibility, so that means you can tilt it, adjust the height, swivel it, and pivot it. But the fact that you can pivot it in both directions, the height adjustment was quite generous as well, and so was the swivel. So it really had good ergonomic flexibility, and I like the overall construction as well, a fairly solid feel to it. I get along quite well with the resolution and screen size as well, decent pixel density, nice amount of desktop real estate there. Of course, not as much as you'd get on a 4K UHD model, but still a decent amount and quite a comfortable pixel density, I find. In terms of the contrast performance, fairly standard IPS type performance there. Static contrast around 1000 to 1. Some are weaker than that, some are a bit stronger than that, so this is quite in the middle there. And the IPS glow as well, a moderate amount of that, quite standard for the panel type. This really isn't the main strength of the monitor, this contrast performance, but I've still seen some worse IPS type models out there. And then if you throw in the screen surface, light matte anti-glare with a relatively smooth finish, I found that quite agreeable. And that isn't something which I always say, and as you'll know if you've seen my videos in the past, it's something I'm quite fussy about, so I was pretty pleased with the surface used here. For the colour reproduction, the monitor offers a little bit of extension beyond the sRGB colour space, but not so much that things really diverge too much from the developer's original intentions for sRGB content. So things look rich, they look natural, and also the consistency is good, so shades appear very much the same whether they're displayed centrally or towards the edge of the screen. Of course, uniformity issues which vary between individual units can affect that to some degree, but you just don't get the kind of clear gamma shifts that you get with TN models or VA models. For responsiveness, you get a bit of a boost with the refresh rate to 75 Hz, a bit of a boost over your standard 60 Hz. This isn't the same as a high refresh rate monitor running at high frame rates. It doesn't give you the same experience, but it still gives you a bit of an edge over 60 Hz at 60 FPS. A bit of an edge in connected feel. Perceived blur is a little bit lower as well. And the pixel responses of the monitor were really very good. It gave a good solid 75 Hz performance. No major weaknesses there, just slight weaknesses, but really nothing which stands out in an obvious way. So a bit of overshoot in places, a very small amount of powdery trailing in other places, but it works well, and adaptive sync worked well as well to get rid of tearing and stuttering from frame rate and refresh rate mismatches within the variable refresh rate range. And of course, because it's a 75 Hz monitor, it doesn't have a massive variable refresh rate range, but it's still nice to have the technology, nice to have it than not. The monitor also includes a mode called rapid rendering. I didn't even mention this in the responsiveness section. That's because it's something which I don't actually much like using at all, and I explore this in the written review, so you can refer to that for more information about this. But this is a strobe backlight setting which causes the monitor to flicker at 75 Hz. You can only activate it at 75 Hz, can't use adaptive sync, but I found this flickering obnoxious. There were flashes of cyan and magenta and other shades which I didn't like. Lots of strobe crosstalk, so things were quite messy. Not a good strobe backlight implementation, but it did still give an edge in terms of reducing perceived blur due to eye movement. But it's quite rare to see this kind of feature on a 75 Hz monitor. It's something of a niche feature. It might have some limited appeal. It's there if you want to use it, but not exactly the best implementation in my opinion. So overall, I feel this is a well thought out monitor. It's well built. It offers good colour performance and it offers pretty decent responsiveness as well. Reasonable contrast, much in line with the expectations for the panel, so basically a good all-round performance, and it is priced very competitively as well. So if you're in the market for this kind of monitor, 60 to 75 Hz, good for productivity and perhaps a little bit of gaming on the side as well, then I'd certainly recommend checking this one out. So that's really all there is to this review of the ASUS PA278QV. Be sure to check out the full review on PCmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.